There is a kind of quiet a burned courthouse leaves behind. You feel it the way you feel a clock has stopped, not by hearing the silence, but by noticing something you grew up trusting is no longer there. I have read the new ledger, the one that opens in the spring of 1871, and the first 5 names in it are written in the same careful hand in the same week, with sums beside them no one in that county should have been holding. I want to tell it slow, the way it came to me, because the worst part of this story is not what was burned, but how clean the new page was. A note before this one begins. If the kind of case I tell here is one you would want to hold in your hands, the actual depositions and ledgers, I have gathered a dossier of files quietly withdrawn from county record between 1865 and 1882, and the link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Now then, the county is Bramble County, in the Piedmont, where the red clay holds the rain and the short-leaf pine holds the wind, and the one river the maps bother to name is called the Deadening. The county seat is Sabbath Cross, up on the hill above the ferry landing, and the courthouse stood at the top of that hill, where every road in the county came up to meet it. I have stood on the foundation where it stood. The squared corners are still there in the grass, lined up with the compass the way the old builders liked. The bricks are gone, the bell is gone, the deeds are gone. Everything that was inside the walls on the night of October the 3rd, 1869, is gone, and what I want you to understand is that October of 1869 was peacetime. Lee had surrendered 4.5 years earlier. The state had been readmitted. The Federal troops on the river flats had folded their tents and moved west. There was no army in the county. There was a courthouse on a hill, and a fire in the courthouse, and by morning the courthouse was not there. The official record calls the cause a defective flue. The flue in the clerk's office had been patched twice that year, and the story goes that the patch gave way on the first cold night of October, and the fire climbed the chimney into the roof. I have read that entry. The hand that wrote it is the same hand that wrote the 5 names the next spring, and that is the thing I keep coming back to. The version the old men told was different. They said the fire was already burning when the first man reached the door. They said the lock had been cut, not broken, cut clean with a cold chisel, and that the door was standing open when the smoke came through. They said the wind was out of the west that night, which is the wrong way for a fire in that chimney to run, because the chimney stood on the east wall. The old men said a great many things, and not one of them wrote any of it down, and most of them were dead by the time I came through, asking. I want you to sit with the shape of what burned, because the shape matters more than the cause. Every deed back to the founding of the county in 1819, every will, every tax roll, every bill of sale, including the bills of sale for the people the county had been buying and selling for 40 years. Every marriage register, including the cohabitation register the Freedmen's Bureau had opened in 1866, so the people the war had freed could make their marriages legal in the county's eyes. All of it in one night, gone. Genealogists have a name for what I am describing. They call it a burned county. Across Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia and the Piedmont of this state, the courthouses burned during the war or in the years just after, and the records went with them. It is common enough that the Library of Virginia keeps a list of the counties that lost their records, and the dates cluster in a way that is worth thinking about. The courthouse in Buckingham County, Virginia, burned in February of 1869. In peacetime, 8 months before the courthouse at Sabbath Cross. I do not say the 2 fires were the same fire. I say they were the same season, and after a while a person who works with old records starts to notice the season. Between the founding of Bramble County in the spring of 1871, There is now a silence in the record. The new ledger opens on a clean page. The first 5 names written into it are written in the same careful hand, in the same week of April. A clean page in a county ledger is not a neutral thing. A clean page is a decision somebody made. The new ledger is a heavy book, half bound in calf, with the county seal stamped into the front board in gold that has gone the color of old brass. The first page is dated April the 8th, 1871. The entries run down the page in a careful hand, the same hand throughout, and the hand belongs to the new county clerk, a man named Wirt Galway. I have held that ledger open on the table in the back room of the current county building, with a clerk watching me to make sure I did not turn the pages too fast. The first 5 entries sit at the top of the first page, one above the other, dated within 4 days of each other, the 8th, the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th of April. The names are Augustin Vetch, Adeline March, Dr. Judah Pell, Hartwell Crane. Beside each name there is a sum. Beside each sum there is a parcel. Beside each parcel there is a short note, the same note in each entry, in the same careful hand. The note reads, "Prior claim restored." I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment, because the whole story turns on it. A prior claim is a claim that was held before, by somebody, for something. Restored means given back. Put them together, and the entry says, a claim that somebody held before the fire has been given back to one of these 5 names. What the entry does not say, and what no entry in the new ledger ever says, is who held the claim before, what the claim was for, when it was made, and where the record of it had been kept. The door, you understand, only opens one way. Wirt Galway was 34, a local man, the son of a miller, educated enough to keep books and honest enough to be trusted with them. He took the clerk's post because the previous clerk had died in the fire and because the circuit judge in the state capitol had written to him personally. The paperwork for the first 5 entries came down from the state capitol in the same letter, already prepared, already notarized, already sealed, and Wirt's job was to copy them into the new ledger on the 8th, the 9th, the 10th. He did not, at the time, ask the question. He was a young clerk with a county to rebuild, and the paperwork was in order, and the judge had signed it. He told himself a great many reasonable things in those first weeks, and every one of them was true, and not one of them was the true. The question came to him 5 years later, in 1876, when the county decided to put together a centennial history for the 4th of July. Wirt was the natural man to write it. He opened the new ledger and turned back to read what the county had been before the war, and he found that the county began in the records he had, in April of 1871. Everything before that was the word of old men. He started riding out to talk to the old men. He asked them mostly about the 5 families. The first thing he learned surprised him. It is the thing I want you to sit with now. The oldest men in the county remembered the 5 names. They remembered them well, but they remembered them as overseers, as factors, as agents, as the men who rode out to collect the rents and tally the cotton and carry the sums back to the big houses. Not one of the old men remembered the 5 as landholders. The man who said it clearest was an old man named Hark Sangri, who lived up in Pinion Hollow, who was 72 that summer, and who had worked the Preston place before the war as a farrier's hand. Wirt sat with him on the porch one evening in June of 1876 and asked about the 5 families, and Sangri looked at him a long time before he answered. And then Sangri said a thing Wirt could not stop hearing for the rest of his life. He said those 5 did not own the land, they worked it, for the men who did. Wirt rode home that night with the question in his chest, and the question had teeth now. because if Sangre was right, the men whose names sat at the top of the clean page were not the men whose land had been taken and given back. They were the men who had been working for the men whose land had been taken and given back. The thing I want you to understand about the wealth that survived the war is that it was mostly not cash. The Confederate money was waste paper by the spring of 1865. What survived was the land, the houses, the cotton gins, and the social connections between the men who held the land. The wealth that walked off in 1865 was human. The wealth that stayed was dirt and pine and the deeds that said who the dirt belonged to. And the deeds, in Bramble County, were the thing that burned. The wealth did not have to be made. It had to be given back to the men who already had it, and the only question was whose names would be on the paper when it was. Wirt decided, in the summer of 1876, to trace the first name backward past the fire. He started with Augustin Vetch, Chi. Augustin Vetch was in April of 1871 recorded as the owner of 1,400 acres on the Deadening, plus a cotton factor's account in Savannah, plus a sum written into the ledger as $11,400 in gold certificate. A cotton factor, if the term is not familiar, is a man who sells a planter's crop for him in the port city and takes a percentage, and the account is the running tally of what the planter has earned and what the factor has advanced him against the next crop. To hold a factor's account in your own name in 1871 was to be, in the eyes of the cotton trade, a planter of substance. Wirt wrote letters. He wrote to the factor in Savannah, to the land office in Milledgeville, to the parish up the coast where Vetch's mother had been baptized. He asked in each the same questions. Where had the account been opened? When? Under what name had the original balance been held? To whom had the 1,400 acres belonged before the fire? The letters came back in the same shape. The records before 1869 were missing, or burned, or never held here, or held in a building that had itself burned. One clerk in Savannah wrote that the factor's books from before 1866 had been lost in a flood. The silence in Bramble County was not a local silence. The burned county was not the only county where the records had gone. One reply was different. It came from a junior clerk at the factor's house in Savannah, written in a hand that shook, on paper that had been folded and refolded in a separate envelope from the official reply, as if the clerk had wanted the official reply to reach Wirt first. The junior clerk wrote that the Vetch account had been opened in March of 1866, not in April of 1871, and that the balance had been transferred into it from an account held under a different name, a name he was not at liberty to commit to paper. He wrote that the transfer had been ordered by a lawyer in the state capital, and that the factor's house had been instructed to treat the Vetch account as a continuation of the older account. He wrote that he was sending this letter against the express instruction of his employer, and that he would prefer Wirt did not write back. Wirt read the letter 3 times. The lamp was low, and the ferry was running below the hill, and he could hear the cable singing in the current the way it sang on a still night. He folded the letter back into its creases, put it in the bottom of the deed box, locked the deed box, and did not sleep that night. What the letter told him even without the name was the shape of the thing. The Vetch money had existed in March of 1866, 3 years before the courthouse burned, under a name that somebody in Savannah was still protecting, in 1876. The entry in the new ledger, dated April of 1871, was not the beginning of the Vetch fortune. It was the moment the Vetch fortune was allowed to appear on a county record, because the county record that would have contradicted it was gone. I want you to sit with the timing, because the timing is the whole story. The money moves in March of 1866. The courthouse burns in October of 1869. The new ledger opens in April of 1871. The money does not move after the fire. The money moves before the fire, and the fire is what makes the move invisible. The Freedmen's Bureau in those first years was the federal office that held the confiscated property of the Confederacy in trust, and the Bureau kept its own books in field offices sent up to the War Department, and the Bureau's record did not depend on the county courthouses. What the Bureau's records show across the South is the same shape I am describing in Bramble County. The confiscated land was held by the Bureau. The former owners filed for its return. The Bureau in the first years refused most of the filings because the land had been promised to the people who had worked it, and then the wind changed. Lincoln was dead, and Andrew Johnson was in the President's house, and the Bureau was ordered, county by county, to give the land back. And the men who came to the Bureau offices to file the claims in 1866 and 1867 were not always the men who had held the land before the war. They were often the men who had been hired by the men who had held the land before the war. Wirt did not, in 1876, have access to the Bureau's records. He had the letter from the junior clerk and the shape of a name he could not say and the beginning of a fear. Turn to the second name on the clean page and to the third. The shape held. Adeline March was a widow. She was recorded in April of 1871 as the owner of the old Preston plantation, 2,200 acres on the upper Deadening, plus the mercantile in Sabbath Cross, plus a sum in the new ledger that ran to $19,000. The Preston plantation was the largest single holding in the county before the war, and I want you to sit with it because it is the key to the whole second name. The Prestons had been the largest slaveholders in Bramble County. John Preston had ridden the county regiment off to Virginia in 1861, and he had died at Gettysburg in the summer of 1863 on the second day on Culp's Hill, in a charge that did not reach the federal line. His widow, Constance, had stayed on the plantation through the war, and a Freedmen's Bureau's field report for 1866 records her, in the careful pencil of the field agent, as destitute. He wrote it twice, destitute, and on the line below, destitute, with 3 children. Constance Preston is recorded as destitute in 1866. The Preston plantation, in April of 1871, is recorded in the new county ledger as the property of Adeline March. Adeline March was Constance Preston's younger sister. She had been Adeline Hale before she married a man named March, who had died of camp fever in 1862. The plantation did not leave the family. It moved one name sideways from a Confederate widow the Bureau had recorded as destitute to her younger sister, who was recorded in 1871 as the new owner under a restored prior claim. I want you to sit with the 2 records side by side, because the 2 records cannot both be honest. If Constance Preston was destitute in 1866, she did not have a plantation to hand to her sister in 1871. If Adeline March had a prior claim to 2,200 acres in 1871, then the family had not been destitute in 1866, and the Bureau's agent had been lied to, or removed, or made to write the word destitute by someone who wanted the plantation to look gone for a few years. One of the 2 records is a true record. The other is a door that only opens one way. Wirt turned to the third name, Theophilus Brand, and Brand was the name that taught him. The arrangement had been built before the fire, not after it. Brand was recorded in April of 1871 as the founder of the Sabbath Cross Improvement Bank. There had been no bank in Sabbath Cross before the war. Brand had come into the county in the winter of 1870 from the state capital. with a charter already drawn up, and he had opened the bank in a storefront on the square in the same week that Wirt wrote the 5 names into the new ledger. Wirt got hold of the bank's first ledger years later, by a road I will not describe. The first deposits in the first week of April 1871 came from 5 account holders. The 5 names: Vetch, March, Brand, Pell, Crane. The bank was built to hold the money the 5 families were about to be given, and it was opened before the money officially existed in the county record. Now, you have to understand the order of operations here, because the order is the whole story. The charter for the bank is dated February of 1871. The deposits hit in the first week of April 1871. The entries in the county ledger are dated the 8th through the 11th of April 1871. The bank was chartered before the entries were written. The clean page was the last step in the arrangement, not the first. The first step was the bank. The 5 fortunes did not appear on the clean page, and then go looking for a place to be kept. The place to keep them was built first, and chartered and opened, and then the 5 fortunes arrived in the same week, and walked through the door of the bank, and walked through the door of the new ledger, and walked into the county as though they had always been there. The mechanism was set up in advance. The clean page was the curtain. Wirt was, by the winter of 1876, genuinely afraid. He had the Savannah letter in the deed box. He had the shape of Adeline March's name, sideways from Constance Preston. He had the charter date of the Improvement Bank. He had the question Sangree had given him on the porch in June. He turned to the 4th name, Dr. Trowell. Judah Pell, and he rode out to Pinion Hollow to ask the old man again. And that was the ride that taught him the question was being watched. Dr. Bell. Judah Pell was, in April of 1871, recorded as the owner of the county's only pharmacy, a warehouse on the ferry landing, and a parcel of 600 acres above Pinion Hollow. Pell had been, before the war, the only licensed physician in the county. He had ridden a horse to houses. He had carried his instruments in a saddlebag. He had not been a landholder, and the 600 acres above Pinion Hollow had belonged, before the fire, to a man named Rafe Audane, who had been the 2nd largest slaveholder in the county, and who had died of pneumonia in a federal prison camp in 1865. Wirt rode out to Pinion Hollow in February of 1877 to ask Hark Sangree the question he had not asked on the porch in June, which was the name of the man the 5 had worked for. He rode out because Sangree was the only man left who had worked the big places before the war and would still talk about it, and because Wirt had begun to believe that the name, if he could get it, was the thing that would let him write the centennial history after all. He arrived at Sangree's cabin at the bottom of the hollow at dusk, and Sangree was sitting on the porch with a Sharps rifle across his knees. The Sharps is a long, heavy, falling black rifle, kind a man does not keep across his knees on his own porch unless he is expecting someone he does not want to expect. Sangree did not get up. He looked at Wirt a long time, told him to come up and sit, and Sangree talked. He named the men who had held the big places, and he named the men who had worked them, and he said, at one point, the thing he had said in June, that the 5 had worked the land for the men who did. And then he said a name? He said it once, low, and he did not say it again. I am not going to give you the name, Sangree said, because the name is the one thing in this story I am still not at liberty to commit to paper, and because Sangree asked Wirt that night not to write it down, and Wirt did not write it down. What I will tell you is that the name was not one of the 5 names on the clean page. The name was one of the names that had been burned. Wirt and Sangree sat on the porch for a long time after the name. The fire had gone down to a low red in the grate, and the hollow was the kind of quiet a hollow gets in February when the wind has stopped. And then a second man walked out of the tree line at the edge of the yard. The second man was someone Wirt did not know. He was a man of about 40, dressed for the cold, and he walked up to the edge of the porch and stopped, and did not come closer, and did not speak to Sangree. He looked at Wirt. He said, "You are the clerk, and you should be at the courthouse," and then he turned and walked back into the tree line, and the trees closed behind him, and he was gone. Sangree did not move. The Sharp's rifle stayed across his knees. He looked at the tree line where the man had been, and he said, in a voice that was almost kind, that Wirt should go home now, and not come back to the hollow. Wirt went home. The Sharp's rifle stayed on Sangree's knees. Wirt did not write the name down, did not ride to Pinion Hollow again. The centennial history went unwritten, and the county celebrated the 100 years without a history, and Wirt sat on the platform with the rest of the county officers and said nothing about the 5 names. What he took from the ride was the shape of a threat. Somebody was still watching the question in February of 1877. 12 years after the war and 6 years after the clean paid. The question had a man in the tree line, and the man had been sent by someone who could read the county clerk's travel plans, and that someone was not a stranger. For 2 years Wirt was quiet. And then, in the spring of 1879, a parcel arrived at the courthouse from a woman in Tennessee he had never heard of, and inside the parcel was a notebook, and the notebook was the thing the fire had been meant to kill. The woman in Tennessee wrote a short letter in a hand that had been taught in a schoolhouse and not in a parlor. Her husband had died in the winter of 1881 of a consumption he had been carrying since the war. In going through his coat she had found a notebook sewn into the lining. Her husband had been, in 1866 and 1867, a field agent for the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, assigned to the Bramble County office. She was sending it to the county clerk because her husband had said in his last years that somebody in Bramble County ought to know what was in it. I want you to understand what a bureau field agent was in 1866, because the notebook only makes sense if you know the man who kept it. The Bureau was a federal office set up in March of 1865 in the War Department to manage the confiscated lands of the Confederacy and oversee the transition of the freedmen to wage labor. The field agents were the men on the ground who rode out to the plantations, recorded who was working the land and who had filed a claim for its return, and sent their reports up to the state office. The notebook Wirt received was not an official report. It was a private record, kept against regulation, in pencil, in a small bound book the size of a man's palm, sewn into the lining of the agent's coat because he had understood by the autumn of 1866 that the official reports were being altered on their way up to the state office, and that the only record that would survive was the one he kept on his body. The notebook lists, month by month through 1866 and 1867, the confiscated and abandoned properties the Bureau was administering in Bramble County. It lists the property, the acreage, the place. It lists the man working the property, who was in nearly every case a freedman working the land for a share of the crop. Lists the former owner who had filed a claim for the property's return. And then there is a fourth column, a column the agent kept that no official record kept. The fourth column lists the men who appeared in person at the Bureau office to file the claims, not the names of the former owners. The names of the men who walked through the door and signed the papers. The 5 names: Vetch, March, Brand, Pell, Crane. filing claims. In 1866 and 1867, on land that the official 1860 county register had recorded as belonging to the Prestons, the Hales, the Adanes, the Lynches, the Crooks. The 5 names were the names of the employees, and the claims were being approved. By the autumn of 1867, by the second agent, the one who had replaced the man who kept the notebook. There is a marginal note in the agent's pencil beside the 5th name, and I want to read you what it says because it is the moment the whole story turns. The agent wrote, "These 5 are not the owners. They are the agents of the owners. The owners are dead, or in hiding, or have signed over power of attorney. The 5 have come to reclaim what was never theirs. I have refused them. I expect to be removed." The next page in the notebook is dated 2 weeks later. The agent was removed. The order came down from the state office in November of 1867, and the second agent was installed in the Bramble County office and approved the 5 claims in December of 1867 and January of 1868. The notebook stops there. The agent stopped keeping it the day he was ordered off the county, because he understood it was now the only honest record of the county, and the only way to keep it was to sew it into his coat. I want you to sit with what the notebook actually says, because the notebook is the answer to every question Wirt had been carrying for 3 years, and the answer is worse than the question. The 5 families were never the owners. They were the agents of the owners. The owners were the men whose names had been on the 1860 register, the Prestons and the Hales and the Audens and the Lynches and the Crooks, the men whose wealth the war had supposedly destroyed. The wealth had not been destroyed. It had been held in trust by the Bureau while the wind was against it, and the moment the wind changed, it was handed to 5 employees who were then recorded on a clean new page in a county whose old records had just burned as the owners of record. The erasure was the erasure of the names of the men who already had it. The middle of a long story is the place a viewer gets tired, and I want to ask you to stay with me here, because what comes next is the part most people do not believe. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight and whether you have ever sat with a document that contradicted the official version of a place you thought you knew. I read them, and then come back to me, because Wirt read the notebook through one long night in the spring of 1879. And by morning he understood that he was holding the only surviving copy of the thing the courthouse fire had been meant to destroy. Hartwell Crane was the 5th name on the clean page, and Crane was the name that explained the other 4. Crane was recorded in April of 1871 as the owner of the county's timber franchise, the new rail spur to the state line, and the chairmanship of the Improvement Bank. He was the only one of the 5 who had not, before the war, been an employee. Crane had been a lawyer in the state capitol, a man who drew up powers of attorney for planters who wanted their business handled while they were at the front, and who, in the first years of the war, had drawn up a great many such papers for a great many planters in Bramble County. The shape of the arrangement comes clear when you put Crane next to the other 4, the 5 owners. The dead Prestons and the hidden Hales and the rest signed powers of attorney through Crane in 1866 and 1867. The 5 employees, Vetch and March and Brand and Pell and Crane himself, filed the Bureau claims under those powers of attorney. The Bureau, after the first agent was removed, returned the land and the stores and the cotton accounts to the 5 names on the paperwork. The 5 names then appeared in April of 1871 on a clean new county ledger as the owners of record, and walked the returned capital into the bank Crane had chartered the winter before. The improvement bank was the vault, and the vault was the engine of the second wave of land transfer. And I want you to sit with the second wave because it is the part that did the lasting damage. The 5 families parked the returned capital in the bank. The bank lent the capital back out to the smaller farmers of the county, the ones who had held 40 acres and a mule and a working chance, at interest rates that were legal because the legislature had made them legal, and ruinous because the legislature had been told to make them legal. The farmers borrowed against the next crop. The crop failed, or the price of cotton fell, the loan came due, the land went to the bank, and the bank was the 5 families. Within 10 years, most of the remaining small holdings in Bramble County had gone the same way. The economists tracked the sons of the slaveholders and the sons of the enslaved. The sons of the slaveholders closed the wealth gap with the North by 1900. The sons of the enslaved did not close it with anyone because there was no wealth to compound, because the land that had been promised had been given back. The clean page in Bramble County was the local shape of a regional arrangement, and the arrangement had a name in the newspapers of the time, and the name was Redemption. Wirt took the notebook home. He did not take it to the courthouse because the courthouse was the place the notebook was most likely to be taken from him. He wrapped it in oilcloth and put it under the mattress, and his wife did not ask him about it, because she had been married to him long enough to know when not to ask. 3 nights later, the clerk's office at the courthouse was entered in the small hours. The deed box was forced. The Savannah letter was taken, along with the centennial notes and the private papers Wirt had kept in the box. The notebook was not there. The notebook was under the mattress. In the morning, the new sheriff, a man named Crane, a nephew of Hartwell Crane, came to Wirt's door to tell him that the office had been robbed by persons unknown and that Wirt should be more careful with the county's papers. The sheriff did not look for the persons responsible. He sat in Wirt's parlor, drank the coffee Wirt's wife made him, and said in a voice that was almost kind, that it was a hard thing to be the clerk of a county with so much history and so little record. Wirt did not say the name Crane aloud. He poured the sheriff another cup of coffee. He saw the sheriff out. And then he lifted the mattress and looked at the oilcloth, and the notebook was still in the oilcloth, and he sat on the edge of the bed and understood with the cold clarity that comes when a thing you suspected becomes a thing you know, that the 5 families were not a historical curiosity. They were the current government of the county. The sheriff was a Crane, the county judge was a Brand, the state senator for the district was a Vetch. The notebook under the mattress was the only thing in the county that said so. Wirt read the notebook a final time that night, by the lamp, with the curtain drawn. He considered sending it to the newspaper in the state capital. He considered sending it to the Bureau, though the Bureau was, by 1879, a fading office with little interest in opening old files. He considered for 1 long hour taking it to the river and burning it himself, because the question had cost him his sleep and his centennial history and his trust in the building he worked in, and he was afraid. And then he turned to the back of the notebook, where the agent had kept, in a different ink, a separate list, and he read his own name. The list was the agent's private list of the men in the county who, in 1866 and 1867, had been helpful to the Bureau's work, the men who had signed the Freedmen's Cohabitation Register, the men who had testified for the freedmen in the wage disputes. Wirt's father's name was on the list. The old miller who had taught Wirt to keep books and to keep them honestly had been one of the Bureau's quiet helpers in 1866. Wirt understood, then, the shape of the choice. If the notebook surfaced, the families would come for the reason his father's name was on a list at all, and the men his father had helped were mostly dead, but their children were not, and the children lived in the same county as the sheriff named Crane. To publish was to set a fire in a county that had already had one fire, and the people who would burn would not be the 5 families. Wirt did not publish. He did not burn the notebook. He wrapped it in a fresh square of oilcloth, went to the back wall of his house, loosened a stone he had loosened once before for a smaller thing, placed the notebook behind the stone, and sealed the gap with lime plaster that matched the wall. And then he took down his family Bible, and in pencil, in the same careful hand that had written the 5 names into the new ledger 8 years before, he wrote 3 sentences on the inside of the front cover. Where the notebook is, what it proves, who to ask for when the time comes that someone can ask. I have read that Bible. I have held the notebook and the oilcloth and the stone from the wall. I am telling you this now because the time has come. The families are long dead, and the only thing left of the arrangement is the record and the question of what to do with it. I am not going to tell you whether Wirt was right to bury it. The notebook's last page is dated September of 1869, 1 month before the courthouse fire, and the entry is a single line in the agent's pencil, written by a man 3 states away who had not been in Bramble County for 2 years, but who had kept a correspondent. The line says, called on the clerk. He has been told to prepare a new ledger for the spring. Old records are to be moved to the capital for safekeeping. He does not believe they will arrive. The old records were never moved. They burned in the courthouse on the night of October the 3rd, 1869, in a fire the official record calls a defective flue. The new ledger opened clean in April of 1871. The first 5 names written into it were the 5 names on the Bureau's approved claims list, and the 5 names on the Bureau's approved claims list were the 5 names on the powers of attorney Crane had drawn up in 1866 and 1867. And the 5 names on the powers of attorney were the 5 employees of the 5 owners whose names had been on the 1860 register, and the 1860 register was in the courthouse on the night of October the 3rd. I am not going to tell you who set the fire. I do not know who set the fire. The agent did not know. Wirt did not know. What I will tell you is what the fire did. The fire did exactly what the arrangement needed it to do on the exact month the arrangement needed it done, in the exact building the arrangement needed it done in, and the only surviving voice that describes the preparation for it is a dead man's pencil in a notebook sewn into a coat. The official record calls it a defective flue. The official record was written by the same hand that wrote the 5 names on the clean page. The official record is the clean page. That is the thing I keep coming back to. The clean page is the crime scene. The clean page is the door that closed. A clean page in a county ledger is never a neutral thing, and a family that appears out of nowhere in the spring of 1871 with 11,000 in gold certificate and 2,200 acres and a bank charter did not appear out of nowhere. The family was always there. The page was what changed. The notebook is on my desk as I tell you this. It weighs what a small bound book weighs, and it smells of pencil and the lining of a coat and a wall behind a stone for 140 years, and the weight of it in my hand is the weight of the only honest record of a county that burned its own memory to give 5 families a clean page. Subscribe if you want these old records kept from going quiet again.